June 18, 1945, somewhere in northern England, a holding camp. Imagine the stillness before dawn, the kind that feels suspended, as though the world itself is holding its breath. Then, without warning, it's broken by a sound sharp enough to pierce bone. 3 crisp metallic knocks. Bang, bang, bang. They struck the steel door like hammer blows, echoing through the cold wooden barracks like a shot fired into silence. Helga Schneider jolted awake, her back stiff from the thin, unforgiving mattress beneath her. Her heart pounded, not just from the noise but from the knowing. This was it. All around her, 20 other women stirred in the half-light of early morning, breath curled from their mouths like smoke, the air damp with chill and something heavier still. Fear. The cloying stench of unwashed wool mixed with anxiety, thick enough to taste. Boots crunched outside, gravel, authority. A man's voice rang out in English, clipped, commanding. Too fast to follow, too harsh to misinterpret. Orders. Helga's hands trembled as she reached for her worn jacket, the fabric rough between her fingers. She didn't need a translation. None of them did. They had all felt this moment crawling toward them from the instant their transport ship docked 3 days ago. Now, it was here. The door groaned open, hinges protesting like old men. Framed in the pale light of a British June morning stood a sergeant. Broad-shouldered, backlit, unreadable. His silhouette was like something from a poster. Only this wasn't propaganda. This was real. And what would unfold in the hours that followed would shake the very foundations of what Helga Schneider believed. Not only about the war, but about the men she thought were her enemies, about herself. If you've ever wondered about the silent chapters of history, the ones too uncomfortable, too complex to fit neatly into textbooks, stay with us. This is one of them. One episode at a time, we're pulling the curtain back. The lie of the enemy. For years, the women of the Reich had been told a simple truth, or so it had seemed. The British, they were told, were monsters, starvers of nations, torturers of prisoners. The stories painted a brutal picture. Allied hands meant agony, degradation, certain death. Helga believed it. She had to. When the sky rained fire and the front lines dissolved like mist, belief became a shield. When the orders changed, go east, no west, no stop, belief was the only thing that remained steady. She was 23, trained as a nurse in Berlin, and had served for 2 years as a medical auxiliary in the occupied territories of France. She had done what she was told. What else was there? Then in early May, just days after Germany's surrender, she was captured near Oldenburg. No last stand, no gunfire, no heroics. The British 11th Armored Division swept in like a tide. Her field hospital, once a schoolhouse decorated with children's chalk scribbles, was surrounded without fanfare. A British officer had entered, surveyed the room filled with moaning, broken bodies and said in halting German, "You are prisoners, stay here." And that was it. He turned and left. 3 days of waiting followed. The last crusts of bread were eaten. The nights brought the low drone of engines and the distant pop of fires. No one knew what came next. Then came the trucks. Nurses, clerks, kitchen workers, switchboard girls. They were all packed in, limbs pressed tight, voices hushed. They rumbled northward through the ruins of a dead empire. The road blurred. Germany gave way to Belgium. Then came the sea. At Ostend, they were herded aboard a freighter, a cargo ship hastily retrofitted for human transport. Its belly held hundreds of women, all Wehrmacht auxiliaries, all prisoners of war. The channel crossing below decks, the air was sour with sickness and dread. Helga huddled in a dark corner, a bucket by her side, heaving up what little remained in her stomach. Around her, the women whispered, sobbed, sometimes lashed out in despair. One, a clerk with a hawkish face, Annalisa, spoke with conviction. They would be forced into British factories, building bombs for the very men who had destroyed their homes. Another, Frau Bauer, gray-haired and sunken-eyed, muttered about labor camps in the Scottish wilds, peat bogs that would tear their hands to ribbons. Helga said nothing. She clung to her canvas satchel, inside a change of clothes, a comb, a photo of her mother, and forced herself to feel nothing at all. And then, After hours of darkness, salt spray, and uncertainty, they landed at Dover. The white cliffs had loomed ahead like a final boundary, the edge of a map where everything known ended. As their freighter approached the coast, the cliffs rose higher, stark and blinding in the pale morning light. To Helga, they didn't seem like land at all, but a wall, a warning. From Dover, they were loaded once again, this time into old British railway coaches. The passenger cars bore the weary scars of war, cracked leather benches, stiff with age, and windows still coated in black paint from air raids that had ceased to matter. No one scraped them clean. No one spoke. The train groaned to life and moved northward through a landscape that seemed absurdly alive. Outside the window, where there was glass, they caught glimpses of a countryside drenched in color. Rolling fields and stone cottages, church spires stabbing the sky, and children laughing as they waved to the train. It was a world untouched, or so it seemed. Inside the carriage, the women sat in silence, each consumed by the same quiet dissonance. The war was over, but they were still at war, still marked, still enemy. Back in the barracks, Helga could feel her pulse in her throat as the British sergeant looked them over. His eyes swept across the group. Not cruel, not cold, just observing, measuring. And then he spoke. "Breakfast, wash first. Line up outside in 10 minutes. His voice was slow, careful, the German clear, not perfect, but deliberate, and oddly gentle. Then he turned, stepped out, and shut the door behind him. No one moved for a breath. Then came a sound, half laugh, half disbelief. Annalisa let it slip from her lips, thin and nervous. "Breakfast," she repeated, like she was testing a word from a forgotten language. "They're feeding us before working us to death. How thoughtful." But Frau Bauer was already walking, her expression unreadable, her gait steady. Toward the washroom she went, without comment. Helga followed. Her legs felt heavy, uncertain. The washroom was barely more than a lean-to, added onto the side of the barracks, narrow and dim. 6 sinks, a row of wooden stalls, functional, Spartan. Cold water sputtered from the taps, but it ran clear, not brown with rust, not reeking of pipes grown stagnant. Helga cupped it in her palms and brought it to her face. The shock of it was electric, sharp, bracing. She gasped, blinked, then looked up into the mirror. Cracks spidered across the glass, distorting her reflection into a dozen fractured versions of herself. But no matter the angle, the truth remained. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Her cheeks had hollowed into shadows. Purple rings encircled her eyes. Her once golden hair hung limp and colorless. She was 23. She looked twice that. 10 minutes passed. Then came the whistle. Outside, they filed into the morning sun, blinking against its brightness. Helga had expected a sprawling, fortified compound, but what she saw instead made her pause. The camp was modest, a cluster of simple wooden buildings, bound by a single line of barbed wire and flanked by just a few guard towers. Beyond the fence, the world opened up into green fields, soft hills, and sheep. Sheep, calmly grazing as though history itself had never happened. The air was tinged with wood smoke and dew. It smelled of spring. It smelled safe. The sergeant led them wordlessly toward a corrugated metal building at the compound's far end. With every step, the structure grew larger, looming. Helga moved with the others, her breath measured, until something stopped her cold. It hit her like a memory, like home. Bread. The scent was unmistakable. Warm, yeasty, rising. Fresh bread. So real, so present, it nearly knocked the wind from her. Her steps faltered. Behind her, Annalise had gone pale. "It's a trick," she whispered. "It has to be." But the door opened, and the smell grew stronger. They were ushered inside. The mess hall was vast, lit by electric bulbs that hummed softly overhead. Wooden tables stretched across the floor in long rows. At the far end, British soldiers stood behind metal serving counters. And on those counters, bread, towering stacks of white loaves, perfectly formed. Not the dense, dark bricks they'd grown used to, but soft, pale, high-risen bread. Real bread. And beside it, tins of butter. Not margarine. Butter, yellow as sunlight. Bowls of porridge steamed in the morning air. Milk in glass jugs. Jam, ruby red, glinting in the light. And tea. Gallons of it. Enough to fill bathtubs. A young British soldier waved them forward. His freckles stood out against his fair skin, and when he spoke, it was with a Midlands lilt. "Come on then, don't be shy. Take a plate." Helga moved without thinking. Her hands found a tin tray, her body falling into the rhythm of a line. Step, stop, step. She didn't look anyone in the eye. The soldier ladled porridge into her bowl. It was thick, rich. He dropped a pat of butter on top. It melted instantly. Then came 2 slices of bread, warm to the touch. He reached for a spoon. Strawberry or blackcurrant? Helga blinked. The question was absurd. She didn't answer. He smiled, not unkindly, and pointed at the jars. "Strawberry," she murmured, the word foreign on her tongue. With a nod, he scooped a heavy spoonful and plopped it onto her tray. "There you are. Tea's at the end." She moved like a sleepwalker. Another soldier poured dark tea into a metal mug and offered her a small tin of condensed milk. "Sugar's just there," he added, gesturing to a bowl overflowing with white crystals. Helga sat. The tray before her was something out of another world. Around her, the other women sat too, slowly, cautiously, as if the tables might disappear if they moved too quickly. No one spoke. No one ate. They stared, unsure if this was kindness or illusion. Then Frau Bauer picked up a piece of bread. She held it gently, reverently, as if it might dissolve in her fingers. She raised it to her nose and inhaled. Her breath caught. A sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped her. She bit into it. She chewed slowly, eyes closing. And then, the tears came. That was all it took to break the dam. All around the long tables, the silence gave way. Women began to eat, some with trembling hands, others with a sudden, fierce urgency, as if they feared the food might vanish if they dared to pause. A few wept openly, tears running freely as they lifted spoons of porridge to their lips. No one pretended to be strong anymore. The act was over. Helga lifted the bread to her mouth and took a bite. The jam, strawberry, was vivid, almost violent in its sweetness. The flavor struck her like a memory she hadn't known she'd lost. After months of scarcity and bitterness, the taste was so overwhelming it bordered on painful. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and felt something inside her. Something buried under uniform and discipline and survival begin to crack. They had been told many things, that the British were monsters, that capture meant cruelty, starvation, maybe worse. But now here, in this cavernous mess hall, flooded with golden light and the scent of warm bread, they were being fed. Not rationed, not processed, fed. More than that, they were being treated like people. Helga looked up, almost involuntarily, and found herself meeting the eyes of the young British soldier with freckles. He was watching them. His face was unreadable, not mocking, not smug, just watching. When he caught her gaze, he gave a small, barely perceptible nod, a quiet acknowledgement. Then he turned away. This was the beginning, though none of them knew it yet. The first fracture in the wall of lies they had carried. The first moment that made Helga question everything she had believed about the enemy. If you think you know how this story ends, think again. This was only the start of a journey that would upend a lifetime of certainty. And if this glimpse into the forgotten truths of history is opening your eyes, stay with us. There's so much more to uncover. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, dreamlike rhythm. Neither punishment nor liberation, just a life suspended. The women were placed in a designated section of the camp, separated from the men, who were quartered somewhere beyond their line of sight. They saw no one but each other and the British guards. Every morning, the same pattern. A whistle at 7, time to wash, then formation and march to the mess hall. And every morning the food was there. Porridge, bread, butter, tea. Some days there were eggs. Once bacon. Once, impossibly, oranges. Real oranges, small and bruised, but fresh and whole. Helga had stared at hers for nearly 10 minutes before eating it, as though it might vanish if she blinked. She couldn't reconcile it, couldn't make it fit into the world she had come from. Just months before in Berlin, she had watched her mother survive on a ration of potatoes and a smear of lard. Before her deployment to France, Helga had queued in endless lines for almost nothing. In the field hospital, meals had been little more than turnip water, and bread so dry it turned to dust in the mouth. And now in British custody, under the rule of the enemy, she was eating better than she had in years. Even the work they were assigned defied logic. There were no ditches to dig, no rubble to haul, no munitions to build. Instead, they were assigned tasks within the camp itself. Cleaning barracks, mending uniforms, cooking, gardening. The labor was light, almost laughably so, not the retribution they had braced themselves for. Helga, because of her medical background, was placed in the camp infirmary, a simple whitewashed building on the edge of the compound. It was run by a British medical officer, Captain Davies. He was in his 40s, balding, with spectacles that slipped down his nose when he read. He didn't speak German, but medicine had its own language, gestures, tools, routine. On her first day, he handed her a bundle of clean bandages and pointed to a supply cabinet. "Stock these," he said in English. Then again, slower, pointing, demonstrating. She understood, nodded. The infirmary was spotless. It gleamed. Metal trays were arranged with geometric precision. The air smelled of carbolic, not decay. Bottles were labeled in clean lettering: antiseptic, sulfur powder, morphine. And there, on one shelf, Helga saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Penicillin. Dozens of vials. In Germany, penicillin had been myth, rumor, a miracle reserved only for the highest-ranking officers, if it was seen at all. Here it sat in orderly rows, unlocked, unhidden. In the weeks that followed, Helga fell into the rhythm of the infirmary. British soldiers came in with sprains, coughs, scrapes, the ordinary injuries of an army no longer fighting. Captain Davies treated each man with quiet precision. No drama, no barked orders. But what astonished Helga most wasn't the medicine. It was how he spoke to them. He asked questions, real ones, about their families, their homes, their plans. He made jokes, called them by their first names. There was no brutality, no distance, just calm, steady care. One afternoon, a young private arrived with a fresh gash across his arm, the result of a careless accident with a jeep door. Helga prepared the gauze while Davies stitched the wound with smooth, practiced hands. The soldier chatted easily, his voice full of life. "My mom sent a letter," he said brightly. "Says my sister's getting married in August. Can you believe it? War's barely over and she's planning a wedding." Davies gave a soft smile. "Good for her. Who's the lucky man?" "School teacher," the private replied. "Met him at a dance in Leicester." Helga stood nearby, silent, invisible. But then the private looked at her, hesitated and flushed. "Sorry, sir. I didn't mean..." "It's fine," Davies said, tying off the stitch. "She doesn't speak English anyway." Then he turned to Helga and in slow German said, "Bandage, please." She handed it over. Her fingers didn't tremble, but her thoughts did. She had just listened to an enemy soldier talk about weddings, dances in a world she'd been told didn't exist. And Captain Davies, the British officer, had spoken to her not as a threat, not even as a prisoner, but as something almost unthinkable, as a colleague. That night, back in the barracks, Helga opened the small notebook she had hidden since the surrender. A battered thing, its corners soft with wear. She wrote in pencil, her handwriting uneven. "I do not understand this place. I do not understand these people. They feed us. They speak to us. They treat our wounds. I was told they were devils, but they are not. And if they are devils, then they are kind ones. I do not know what to believe anymore." Helga wrote the words slowly, as if shaping each letter might help her understand them. But no understanding came, only more questions. The world she had known was being unmade, not with violence, but with small acts of unexpected grace. She was not alone in this unraveling. Each woman in the barracks was undergoing her own quiet revolution. Annalisa, who had been assigned to the camp laundry, came back one evening with damp hair clinging to her neck, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They have soap," she whispered to Helga, holding out her raw, reddened hands as proof. "Real soap, big bars. It smells like flowers. And the water is hot. Hot, Helga. Coal boilers." Her voice broke. "I washed my hair today. My hair. I had forgotten what clean feels like." Frau Bauer, now working in the kitchen, had been entrusted with the storeroom keys. Flour, sugar, lard, all shelved like treasure. One day she had baked a cake, a real one, soft and spiced with dried fruit and powdered sugar, for a British cook's birthday. She had carried it out like an offering, unsure if she'd be mocked, dismissed, or worse. But the cook had grinned, thanked her, and sliced the cake evenly, sharing it with the whole staff, Germans included. Frau Bauer wept again that day, not in grief or hunger, but into her apron, tears sliding silently down her cheeks while the others ate in hushed disbelief. No one spoke. They simply chewed and watched the kindness unfold like something sacred. And yet, not everything was gentle. There were frictions, of course. One guard, a corporal named Wilson, had a face like stone and eyes that never smiled. He muttered in English, sharp-edged words the women couldn't translate, but they felt the weight of them in their bones. The contempt needed no interpretation. There were rules. No leaving the compound. No fraternizing. Lights out at 10. But they were rules built on structure, not cruelty. It was discipline, not dominance. And still, the food came. Every morning, every night, as regular as breath. Helga began to see things she hadn't noticed before. The way the guards worked in shifts, never overburdened. The way the camp commander, Major Ainsworth, gray and gravel-voiced, walked the perimeter each morning, nodding to prisoners with a kind of stiff, habitual respect. Not warmth, not friendliness, but recognition. One afternoon, the rain came down in silver sheets. Helga stood watching from the infirmary window. Across the yard, an elderly German woman struggled with a basket of wet potatoes, her back bent, her scarf sagging with water. One of the guards, not Wilson, stepped out from the dry cover of his post, walked briskly over, and handed her his umbrella. No words, just action. It was such a small thing. But it cracked something open. That evening, near the end of June, the women were invited to gather in what had once been a storage shed. It had been cleared out, swept, and converted into a kind of common room. Inside, there were a few chairs, a battered upright piano pushed against the wall, and an air of cautious permission. A British chaplain, Father O'Brien, short, white-haired, kind-eyed, had arranged for music, a corporal with an accordion, a private with a harmonica. A few volunteers sang softly in English, unfamiliar melodies, folk songs full of longing and green hills and faraway lovers. The German women sat shoulder to shoulder, uncertain, backs straight, hands in laps. They did not know what to do, what to feel. Then Father O'Brien stood, cleared his throat, and in halting, careful German said, "You may sing too if you wish. Music is for everyone." The silence stretched. Then quietly from the front row, Frau Bauer began to sing. Her voice was low, cracked, almost whisper thin, but the melody was unmistakable. A lullaby. Guten Abend, gute Nacht. Helga froze. The song took her back to a Berlin bedroom, her mother's voice at her bedside, the war not yet begun. Others joined in, one by one. The music rose, hesitant, wavering, but real. A choir of broken voices remembering something soft. The British soldiers stopped playing. They listened. No one interrupted. When the last note fell into silence, Father O'Brien nodded. His eyes shimmered behind his glasses. "Beautiful," he said. "Thank you." Helga sat in that room, surrounded by uniforms that no longer frightened her, by men she had called enemy, and she felt it, the final, slow collapse of certainty. Not defeat, not surrender, something quieter, a shedding. But even amidst the gentleness, shadows remained. There were things no loaf of bread could undo, no lullaby could silence, and those shadows would not be easily dismissed. Greta didn't speak of what had happened. She didn't need to. The truth was written in the bruises that bloomed across her skin, in the way she flinched at sudden sounds, in the muffled cries that escaped her at night when the barracks were dark and still. A young signals operator, Greta had been caught in the chaos of the retreat through Mecklenburg, and what the Soviet soldiers had done to her in those final, collapsing days was something that could not be undone. She moved through the camp like a shadow, silent, hollow-eyed. She ate what was given to her, mechanically, without expression. She never met the eyes of the guards, not even the kind ones. Helga tried once. She sat beside her on the edge of a bunk, keeping her voice low, gentle. "We're safe here," she murmured. "They're not like the others." Greta turned to her slowly, her face a blank slate. "Safe," she said, tasting the word like ash. "There is no such thing." Helga had no answer. There were no arguments to make, only silence. And yet for the others, for those not locked behind Greta's wall of grief, the transformation continued. In early July, something remarkable happened. The camp received Red Cross parcels, real ones, marked with the emblem of neutral Switzerland, filled with goods that seemed torn from dreams. They were distributed without ceremony, without judgment, one for each woman, no matter what they had done, no matter what uniforms they had worn. Helga opened hers alone, sitting cross-legged on her bunk. Inside, a bar of Swiss chocolate, dark and bitter, a tin of sardines, a small can of condensed milk, a pack of American Lucky Strikes. She stared at the contents as though they were artifacts from a lost world. She broke off a square of the chocolate and let it melt slowly on her tongue, eyes closed. It was rich and sharp, so intense it almost hurt. In Berlin, starving children would have fought over a morsel like this. In France, she had traded cigarettes for powdered egg, and now in this strange limbo, she held luxury in her hands. At the infirmary, Captain Davies had begun teaching her simple English phrases: bandage, water, hold still, you're fine. He spoke slowly, repeating each word until she grasped it. Sometimes when she stumbled over pronunciation, he laughed, not cruelly, but kindly. The sound of it filled the sterile white room with warmth. It was a strange kind of closeness, forged not in words but in gestures and repetition, in iodine and gauze, in the quiet rhythm of care. One afternoon, as she was scrubbing a tray of surgical instruments, Davies gestured to her, then pointed at himself, then to her again. He was asking, "Where are you from?" "Berlin," she said. He paused, thinking. Then, in English, slowly, "I was in Berlin, in '36, the Olympics." Helga looked up, startled. Davies reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. In it, a younger version of him smiled in front of the Brandenburg Gate. His arm was around a woman, his wife, Helga guessed. Behind them, the city stood whole, untouched, brilliant with summer light. "It was beautiful," he said softly. "I'm sorry for what's happened to it." Helga took the photo in her hands, staring at a version of her city that felt like a ghost. When she handed it back, her throat was tight. An apology from a British officer for her city. That night, she opened her diary again and wrote, "Captain Davies showed me a picture of Berlin before the war. He said he was sorry. I did not know what to say. I wanted to tell him I am sorry too, for everything, for all of it. But the words would not come. Maybe there are no words for what we have done to each other." By midsummer, the camp no longer felt like a cage. It was still surrounded by wire, yes, but the sense of imprisonment had blurred, softened, transformed into something else, something in between. The women learned the rhythms of life under the Union Jack, the sound of the bugle in the morning, the pause for tea in the afternoon, the curious Friday ritual of fish and chips served in waxy paper with malt vinegar and peas. They learned names, faces. Corporal Wilson, sharp-tongued, grim, sent half his pay to a widowed mother in Manchester. And Tommy, the freckled young soldier from the mess hall, kept his sweetheart's letters folded neatly in his breast pocket, rereading them on breaks, his lips moving silently over each line. One warm evening in mid-July, the camp marked something called Bastille Day. Helga had never heard of it. Another foreign word, another foreign war. Father O'Brien explained in his careful German that it was a French holiday. A revolution, he said with a twinkle in his eye. The camp held French prisoners too, Vichy collaborators, kept in a separate enclosure, but visible now and then across the yard. The British had decided to honor the day with extra rations and a bonfire. The German women were invited. That night, the sky was painted in strokes of gold and rose, and the fire crackled in the center of the compound like a beacon. Sparks floated upward into the twilight. Everyone, British, German, even a few of the Frenchmen under light supervision, gathered loosely around the blaze. Sausages sizzled on sticks. Weak beer was passed around. Someone brought out a violin. Someone else produced a battered harmonica. A ripple of music drifted across the yard. Laughter rose, jokes that Helga didn't understand, but that made the soldiers clutch their sides and wipe their eyes. Helga sat on a bench beside Frau Bauer, the two of them holding tin mugs of lukewarm beer, watching the strange carnival unfold. It felt like a celebration of something none of them could name. Not freedom, not victory, not peace, but possibility. A hint that the world, broken though it was, might still be capable of stitching itself back together. She sat beside Anneliese and Frau Bauer, close enough to feel the fire's warmth against her knees, the smoke curling through the summer air like incense. Across the flames, Tommy raised his tin cup in her direction, not smiling, just offering a silent toast. Helga nodded once. It wasn't much, but in that flicker of recognition between former enemies, across barbed wire, language, and grief, it felt like something sacred. Enemies sharing fire, sharing food, sharing this strange patch of earth beneath a darkening sky. I never thought I'd live to see this, Anneliese murmured beside her, voice barely louder than the crackle of burning wood. None of us did, Frau Bauer replied. Helga said nothing. She only watched the fire burn, her face lit by its light and shadow. There were no words for moments like this. In August, word came down. The repatriation process had begun. The British were starting to send POWs back, or at least to transit camps in Germany, where they'd be sorted, questioned, and eventually released. The announcement swept through the women like a gust of wind. Some wept with relief, hands clasped, laughter breaking into sobs. But Helga felt something different. Not joy, not fear, something hollow. Home. What did that word even mean now? Berlin was ash. The last letter from her mother had arrived in March. Brittle paper covered in worry and fading ink. It had said the apartment building had been hit. Nothing more. No news since. No confirmation, just silence. She didn't know if her mother was alive. She didn't know what waited on the other side of the channel, or if anything did. The night before departure, Captain Davies summoned her to the infirmary. His office was quiet, lit by a single lamp. He handed her a folded piece of paper, the corners creased, the seal unmistakably British. For you, he said in careful German, a letter of reference, in case you need work. You are a good nurse. Helga opened it slowly. Though the words were in English, she could read enough. Her name printed clearly, the British Army's crest at the top, and at the bottom, his signature, his name. She looked up, her throat tightening. Thank you, she managed. He nodded. Good luck, Fräulein Schneider. She wanted to say something more, to tell him how this place had changed her, how she would carry the memory of this strange, gentle captivity with her always. The clean floors, the chocolate, the English phrases, the photograph of Berlin before it burned. But the words tangled. Nothing seemed right. So instead, she did what she had been trained to do. She saluted, an absurd gesture, outdated, ridiculous, and entirely sincere. At dawn, the transport trucks arrived. 30 women, including Helga, Anneliese, and Frau Bauer, were loaded up with their few possessions. The vehicles rumbled southward, the air filled with dust and the distant whine of engines. At the coast, they boarded a passenger ferry, not a freighter this time. There were benches, railings, even tea served in paper cups. As the vessel pulled away from the dock, Helga stood at the rail and watched the white cliffs recede into the mist, growing smaller with each passing minute. England, that strange, unfathomable island of bread and bandages, disappeared behind them. What followed was not a return, but a descent. The sorting camp near Hamburg was chaos, a sprawling tent city of broken people, refugees, POWs, survivors without homes, without names. The food was back to watery broth and black bread. The latrines overflowed. Disease moved through the camp like smoke, invisible and relentless. Helga used her letter from Captain Davies to secure a place in the makeshift hospital, if it could be called that. There were no supplies, no penicillin, sometimes not even soap. She did what she could, which was almost nothing. In September, she was finally released and given travel papers. She made her way to Berlin, by train, by military truck, and when the train gave out 20 kilometers from the city, on foot. Her shoes were worn through, her legs ached, but she walked. And when she arrived, she barely recognized the city she had once called home. Berlin was a skeleton, whole districts flattened. The air smelled of ash and something worse. The rubble seemed endless, piles of stone and twisted metal where homes had once stood. She found the address. There was no building, just a crater filled with blackened bricks, shattered tiles, and silence. An old man with rheumy eyes and a cane stood watching. He remembered her, a neighbor. "Your mother," he said. "She died. April, bombing raid." Then he handed her a bundle wrapped in cloth. No ceremony, no comfort. Inside, a pewter spoon. Her mother's wedding ring, a photograph of Helga as a child, smiling in the sunlight. She stood in the ruins with those three objects in her hands and felt the full weight of everything she had lost, pressed down on her like a second sky. The war was over. She had survived. But everything else, everyone else, was gone. And yet somehow life continued. In the years that followed, Helga found work as a nurse in a clinic, cobbled together from scraps. She lived in a bombed-out apartment with 5 other women. She bartered cigarettes for potatoes. She stitched wounds. She boiled water. She kept going. And through it all, her memory circled back, again and again, to that British camp in the north, to the tea, the porridge, the violin music, to Captain Davies and his soft-spoken apology for Berlin. She told her story to anyone who would listen. Some nodded, thoughtful. Others scoffed. "You were brainwashed," they said. "They were the enemy. You were their prisoner." But Helga never stopped telling it. Because it was true. Because amidst all the darkness, there had been one place, just one, where the world had made a little sense again. And that, she believed, was worth remembering. But some did listen. And in their eyes, Helga recognized something. A flicker, a shift. That same flicker she had felt in the mess hall on that cool June morning in 1945. The beginning of understanding. The enemy had fed them. The enemy had looked them in the eye and treated them like human beings. And the enemy, it turned out, had been human all along. In 1947, Helga married a schoolteacher named Ernst, a thoughtful man who walked with a limp, his left leg lost in the frozen nightmare of Stalingrad. They were not a grand love story, but a quiet one. A story of 2 people who had survived too much, who didn't need to explain their silences to each other. They had 3 children. Helga never returned to nursing full-time. The clinic closed. There were no hospitals hiring, no money to pay even the most skilled hands. But she volunteered when she could. At a church hospital, teaching girls barely older than she'd been. Girls who had grown up in ruins, how to clean a wound, how to boil water properly, how to keep hope from slipping away entirely. She kept Captain Davies' letter of reference in the bottom drawer of an old wardrobe. The paper had yellowed, the ink faded, but the British crest still gleamed faintly in the light. Sometimes she took it out and read it aloud to herself, not because she fully understood all the English words, but because of what it represented, because it had come from him. In 1953, a letter arrived, unexpected, out of time. It had been routed through the Red Cross. The return address, Birmingham, England. Inside was a brief note, the handwriting instantly familiar. It was from Captain Davies. Somehow, through some improbable miracle of bureaucracy and determination, he had found her. He wanted to know if she had survived. He wrote that he had retired from the army and now worked as a general practitioner. A small clinic, nothing grand. He enclosed a photograph. Himself, older now, standing in front of a modest brick building, a stethoscope draped over his shoulders. On the back, in careful German, he had written, "Ich hoffe, es geht Ihnen gut. Ich habe Sie nicht vergessen. I hope you are well. I have not forgotten." Helga wept. She wrote back the same evening, piecing together her reply from a battered German-English dictionary, from Ernst's careful suggestions, from memory. She told him about Berlin, about her children, about the hard, slow work of putting one's life back together from ashes. She thanked him, again, for the bread, the penicillin, the kindness he had offered in a place where kindness should never have existed. She didn't know if the letter would reach him, but she sent it anyway, a fragile thread flung across time and borders. He replied. And for the next 2 decades, they wrote to one another. Just once or twice a year, postcards at Christmas, letters in spring, updates about grandchildren, news of failing joints and new roofs, quiet reflections about memory and what it meant to be old in a world that had changed so much. They never saw each other again. But the correspondence endured, quiet proof that something had been salvaged from the wreckage. That beneath all the uniforms and languages and lines on the map, there had always been people, real people. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Helga was 73. She sat in her small apartment, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, watching history unfold on television, cheering crowds, crumbling concrete, strangers weeping in each other's arms. And all she could think about was that morning in June 1945, when a British sergeant had opened a door and offered her breakfast. She died 3 years later, in her sleep, in the same apartment she had shared with Ernst for 45 quiet years. After the funeral, her children went through her things. In the bottom drawer of the wardrobe, they found a bundle wrapped in string, the photograph of her as a little girl, the letter of reference, and a stack of correspondence from England. At the memorial, her eldest daughter stood before the gathered mourners and read from Helga's wartime diary, the entry from June 18, 1945. "Today I learned that the enemy is not a monster. Today I learned that I had been lied to my entire life. Today I learned that even in defeat, there can be dignity. I do not know what happens next, but I know that I will never forget this." The knock on the door that morning had sounded like judgment, like punishment. It had brought bread instead. And in that quiet reversal, in that single bewildering act of mercy, an entire worldview had come undone. What Helga Schneider and thousands of women like her discovered in British POW camps was not just food or safety or even forgiveness. They discovered truth, and that truth was this: that the people they had been taught to hate were capable of grace. That truth, more than any battle or treaty, ended the war inside them. It lived on, in whispered stories, in broken German diaries, in memories passed from mother to child. And in that way, in kitchens and classrooms and quiet conversations, it helped shape something new. A different Germany, one that could begin, slowly and painfully, to reckon not just with what had been done to it, but with what it had done, because the bread had been real, the kindness had been real. And so, in the end, so was the transformation.